Hi everybody, it's Dr. Jensen with CCJ 3701, Research Methods for Criminology. And I want to just mention I am still a little bit ill, so I apologize for that if I have to cough occasionally. But I wanted to do this video for you and talk about how to get your data all organized for your final paper. So at first glance, you may say, hey, we've already done this, recoding variables. I know how to do this. And you've come so far in this class and worked your way through so many labs and worked really, really hard through tedious processes, and it's paying off, and hopefully things are coming together for you. But we're going to use this video to talk about how to apply these skills to your study so you can start making some decisions about what you need to do and make some progress in your final paper. So, again, just recoding variables, you want to jot down a couple of notes so you can think about some things that you can use with your data, because you're largely going to be making these decisions on your own. However, don't be afraid to reach out. So if you think you might need to recode a variable, but you're not sure, and you just want to run it by me or by a graduate teaching assistant first, feel free to shoot out an email, and we can consult together and help you decide whether it needs to be recoded or not based on what you're wanting to analyze. So yeah, that's not a problem at all. Just feel free to reach out. So remember, when you recode, you may not have what you need, and so recoding helps you get what you need that you want to analyze. We're going to do an example at the end of this so you can kind of see how this might work in your study, and also come up with a strategy of how to do it. So we can create what we need by doing recoding, right? We've done all kinds of stuff. We've built scales, we've built summations. You can use filters. I don't use them very much. You can do conditions, and you can recode in so many ways. So just keep that in mind, depending on what you're trying to analyze. And remember, recoding doesn't mean you're creating data out of thin air. All you're doing is reorganizing the responses inside them differently than how they currently are in order to make a comparison or prepare it for something else you're making. So you're not getting data out of nowhere. Make sure you keep that in mind. This is the list you're going to want to think about when you get your variables. So this helps you decide if it needs to be recoded. Do I need to create a new variable that's different than what I have? Do I need to correct bad data? Now, you're probably using data from a good source that's already been quality checked, so probably don't need to worry about that one. Preparing a variable you're about to combine with another one. Changing the level of measurement. So for example, maybe you have a variable that is how many times have you smoked marijuana, and you don't really care about that. You just want to know if they have. So you're going to maybe change the recoding from a number or an interval quantity to just have you or have you not. You're changing it from interval to nominal. You may recode it simply to just handle the missing data parts of the variable. Maybe you're not making any changes to it other than to make sure that those I don't know and blank responses and not applicable are set aside so they don't get pulled into your analysis. You may be recoding in preparation for building a scale or a summation. Maybe you're pulling a bunch of variables together, like drug use, or you're building an offense scale or a delinquency scale. Pardon me. You may be creating a condition to use for another variable, or you may be making dummy variables, maybe with controls. So I'll show you that in a minute. But those are things to think about when you're looking at your variable. Okay. Again, you guys already know the steps for recoding. You got to decide in advance the purpose, review the variable, make sure you know it well, make your plan, define those old and new values that you're going to be changed and how you're going to change them by writing or typing up a quick plan. Implementing your plan in the transform menu, and then once you're done, run a frequency of the original variable and your new variable you recoded, just to check and make sure everything is right. So the one you're probably going to use the most is dummy variables, right? So we use the 1-0 coding scheme quite a bit, and you'll use this in all kinds of ways. They use it in biology, they use it in political science, they use it in chemistry. Anytime you need to do kind of a comparison, one versus something else, we use ones and zeros. So it's common not just in criminology or social science, but across any science that uses statistics. Excuse me. Let's work on a race variable. Many of you are maybe using race as an independent variable. or you may be using it as a control variable to see if maybe the change you're interested in seeing happen is different for different racial groups. So let's talk about this for a moment. If we were to go into SPSS, this is the Ad Health data set, and I have the race single category variable pulled up. And when I click on the variable labels, I have a lot of racial groups that I can work with here. White, Black or African American, American Indian, Native American, Asian, Pacific Islander, and other. Now there are certainly other racial variables that will contain different racial groups. There's an ethnicity variable that has Hispanic or Latino in it, so you can kind of look at how you want to do that. But maybe this is your variable you're interested in. You want to look at race. And you say, well, actually, I just want to look at the experience of Blacks and look at how they interact with the criminal justice system versus how other people are treated or how they interact. So maybe the way this variable is right now is not really suitable for an analysis of that kind. You would want to make sure you set aside Black and African Americans and compare them to the experiences of others. Now, there's a lot of ways you could do this. Let's talk about this. Going back to our dummy variables, when making a dummy variable, and again, a dummy variable is just kind of a placeholder to represent a group compared to other groups. If you have multiple categories, just like that race variable that we looked at, the maximum number of variables that you could create out of it is always what we call k minus 1, where k is the total number of categories in it. So if we go back to the race variable, we're not going to look at these missing data categories, refused, legitimate skip, I don't know. We're just going to look at the ones that apply. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The maximum number of variables we could make out of this would be 4. Okay, so there's only 5 racial group categories in the variable. And so K would be 5. 5 minus 1 is 4. Now why, why is that? The reason we have it that way is, remember, the word variable means to vary. Right? We have to have differences between one group and another in order to have variance, in order to test for those differences. So you have to keep one group set aside as the zero group, or we call it the referent group or the comparison group. So that way we can see how this experience is different from this one. So one group always has to be set aside for that comparison, and then the other groups you can actually use to be your ones. So most of the time in a race variable, usually the zero group is white, okay? Because that's the group we tend to know the most about in research, and often we're interested in the experience of minority groups. So you could make Black or African American, American Indian, Asians, and others a 1, compared to whites a 0. Now, if you did a variable like that, basically you would have a non-white versus a white variable. Maybe you really only want to look at the Black versus white experience. Excuse me. In that case, you would just set aside Black and African Americans as 1, whites as 0, and then these other groups you could set aside to missing because you're not going to be analyzing them. You could do so many different kinds of variables and different kinds of comparisons. You could do Asians and Native Americans versus Blacks. You could make any comparison you want as long as you have a 1 group and a 0 group. Now, a mistake I see students make often is they forget about that 0 group, or they get confused. And when they do a 0 group, sometimes they focus so much on who they want to analyze, the ones, the presence of the attribute they're interested in, that they forget about the zeros. You have to have zeros in your variable if you're going to make a dummy variable like this, because they're going to have no way to count or compare the experience of this versus the experience of that. Okay? So occasionally students will set one category to a 1, and then all the other categories they'll set to missing. That is a mistake. It happens quite a bit, but a 0 is really not the same as missing data. Okay, so I just wanted to point that out. A 0 means I'm still in your variable. I'm still being counted. I'm just being counted differently, but I'm still being analyzed. Missing data means I'm not in the variable. I'm being set aside and removed, and I'm not going to be part of the analysis, and I'm not counted in there at all. Okay, so even though 0 and missing may seem the same, they are not. You still use 1s and 0s so that you can have that variation inside your variable. So that way we can see the difference between having this attribute versus not having it. Okay, so these are some things to think about if you're going to work on a variable called race. You have to think about the racial group that you're interested in and what comparison you want to make. Again, in social sciences, we often compare a minority group versus a white group, but you could compare two minority groups if you wanted to. Of course, you'd want to have a good reason for doing that. And often the excuse me, the articles you read and the other studies that you look at will serve as a good guide to how maybe you should go about things. Okay, so as you get ready to make your variables, these are things you want to think about. So if I just tuck this variable as is into a regression equation, it would think it's an interval variable that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you would get a coefficient and you would get an R squared and you'd get a constant and all the stuff that comes out of a regression output, but it wouldn't mean very much. It would say a 1 unit increase in race is equal to this subsequent change on the dependent variable. Well, that doesn't make any sense. What's a 1 unit increase in race? Okay, we don't we don't do that with categorical data. We make comparisons from one category to another, but we don't say are you more black or more white or more other? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. The same thing happens when we look at gender. Some people are interested in gender in their study. If you were just to leave the gender variable as is, just 1 and 2 or, something like that in your study, again, it would think a 1 unit increase, is, changing genders. So we have to kind of think about what it means when it gets thrown into SPSS. That's why we kind of stick to the 1-0 dichotomy, because that makes a lot more sense in interpretation. So because we love categories and nominal variables, we love group membership, we love learning identities about people, and they are very important predictors when it comes to criminology. We need to make sure they're coded properly so that we can interpret them properly. Okay, so again, that's just my example with race, but you could certainly do this kind of a thing with many other variables depending on the category that you're interested in. So most of the time, if you have a nominal or a ordinal variable that is an independent variable or a control variable, most of the time it needs to be recoded so you can make those comparisons that you're interested in. Very rarely can you just leave it as is. It's pretty obvious to me when you get output in your final paper if you forgot to recode something. I can tell. So when in doubt, recode it. Now don't recode things you don't need to, but for those variables, usually you do. Okay, well hopefully you found this helpful and you can start thinking about how to change your variables and get things prepared so that when you get ready to run your own regressions on your own data, you can. Now, on that note, if you do have questions about which regression to run, we're going to do a whole project on that, an assignment that'll help you determine which one you need to do, and then also give you some practice at running it on your stuff and interpreting your stuff and some feedback on if you're doing it right. So you'll be seeing that in the next few weeks. You'll actually do a regression project on your data. So you get a chance to do it in advance before you just go out there willy-nilly. All right, so hopefully this worked for you. But again, reach out if you have questions about whether or not to recode, and we'll see you later.